know I'm gonna get killed for this review. Yeah, this is my review for Eyes Wide Shut. This came out in 1999. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick, and he died before the film was actually released, so obviously this was his last film. I've talked about Kubrick so often on here that I'm just gonna skip the intro and just jump right into it, because I have seen Eyes Wide Shut many times in my life, and I was really excited to watch this movie again and review it. I was like, yeah, it's gonna be awesome. I'm gonna have all these great ideas. I'm gonna praise it and all of that. But something happened watching it this last time where I've always defended it as this sort of erotica masterwork, right? But it had so much less of an impact on me this time. I found it to be skeletal as a movie experience. I like to say movie experience rather than story, because Kubrick is an experience-driven person, and it just makes more sense that way to say it. But I found a lot of the ideas they're going for, about that has to do with sexuality and cruelty and how all of that relates to marriage, relationships, all of that to be somewhat half-baked. And the motivations here aren't very clear, nor are the characters very developed enough for them to make sense in the long run. And I think the reason why is because there is so much ambiguity. Ambiguity is good to an extent, but I think too much is not a good thing. I'm really torn here because there are a lot of things that I admire about the film, because, I mean, it's a Stanley Kubrick film. I mean, he's an extraordinary artist, an extraordinary filmmaker, one of my all-time favorites. And even though this has never been one of my favorite movies of his, I still think it has that hypnotic allure that he's known for, only he can do. It's a film that is intriguing and worth discussing. So in that sense, I, of course, appreciate it. This film is, of course, a sort of Freudian, hyper-sexualized to some. I don't see it as that at all, but it's a sort of dream / odyssey film, and it revolves around a married couple. And this couple is played by Tom Cruise, who is this very well-respected doctor, and Alice, Nicole Kidman. And actually, in real life, the two were married at the time. And this couple, I mean, they're very well-off, living in New York City. They're beautiful, and on the outside, they look perfect. But of course, no relationship is perfect, and here we're starting to see the cracks in the veneer. In a pivotal scene, Nicole's character, Alice, admits that she has had fantasies about another man while she was married, and her husband just can't comprehend this for whatever reason. He can't comprehend that his wife would ever have fantasies about anyone other than him. I don't know if I buy into that. I find that notion to be really kind of unrealistic and hilarious at the same time. I mean, it's as if the Tom Cruise character is like a teenager and has no comprehension of sexuality at all. I mean, we presume that this guy is smart. I mean, as I said, he is a very well-respected doctor, and yet he has such a simplistic view of his wife and women in general, thinking that they lack a sex drive and the hunger for sexual infidelity, but whatever. So after he hears this terribly shocking news, he goes on this long drive through New York City, and he has all sorts of interesting events. Things happen to him. A lot of different kind of sexual encounters, I guess you could say, that supposedly help us to understand him, the sexuality within him, and a lot of the complexities that drive this particular person and his marriage. I'll start with what I like about the film, and I'm going to start with Nicole Kidman. She is just penetrating on screen, no pun intended, but there's just so much beneath her eyes. She has this kind of delirious, very dreamy way of how she delivers her dialogue, but there's just this feline-esque, this ferocity in her eyes. You can always tell something is really simmering underneath there, and it's a bit scary. You're not quite sure what it is. And I think that look that she has is very key in the film, especially in the scene where she's revealing the sexual fantasy. That's a brilliant scene. I love that scene, and in that, she's just wringing every emotion she can out of it to make it feel real and very emotionally potent. And she's acting circles around her poor husband Tom. But I would say of all the scenes in the film, if you're just going to watch one, make it that scene. It's really good. And it must be said, but of course the style of the film is quite extraordinary. I have, and I've said this many times, anytime I've talked about Kubrick on this channel, I've always said that, you know, I'm a very verbose person, but I've always had trouble putting into words what it is about Stanley Kubrick that makes him special. His films are very experience driven. It's very sensory. It's got a clinical, detached quality. That there's that paradox of it being very magnetic at the same time, and he really breaks through the boundaries of what we normally feel with our entertainment. And he's sort of blurring the lines on the emotional spectrum, and that is my favorite part, what I take away the most from his films. The Nerd Writer put up a video about Eyes Wide Shut that I thought was really interesting, where he talked about how the film is very similar to a video game, and I think that you could say the same thing for anything that Stanley made, 2001: A Space Odyssey and on, anything after that point. And I thought that was brilliant, because it's absolutely true. And I never thought of that. And now watching Eyes Wide Shut with that in mind, of course I couldn't get it out of my head. Kubrick is able to take you on this journey, and he really stretches the tension more and more and more like a rubber band. You feel each moment beat for beat. He's known for having the camera always following the protagonist through hallways and down staircases, all of that. He also uses a lot of wide angle lenses to really immerse you in the experience as though it's really happening. And I would say he's very much ahead of his time in that respect. He has a way of just gripping you, and he doesn't let go of you even after the film is over. It could be days and you're still thinking about the film, not sure whether or not you liked it or not. And though I don't think that this film showcases his abilities in the most effective ways, I think they're still very present and deserve to be recognized for what they are. But it is still frustrating for me, and I'll talk a little bit about Tom Cruise, because he is the protagonist, and I don't think that he works here at all. I understand what Kubrick is doing. He's trying to take somebody that can kind of fill the role of a very seemingly superficial, handsome doctor. And of course, that's what Tom Cruise is really known for, just playing kind of, yeah, a very surface level celebrity action hero. So he's perfect for playing somebody that is shallow. But I think that a lot of times directors will do that. They'll take an actor that is known for something else to really show what they're capable of and what's underneath, and I don't think that Tom Cruise has that at all. I'm sorry, I've never found him to be a compelling actor. He tries really hard, I'll give him that, and he does in everything. I've never found his persona interesting at all, but he works really hard. You can tell he puts a lot of effort into it. But he is so external, and there's nothing to kind of peer into, and I think that's a real problem. I would have much rather have gone on this particular journey with the Alice character, Nicole Kidman's character, because she's the one that is interesting, and she's the one who really has something to prove to her husband, because he sees her in this way that is not her. He sees her as passive and somebody who is maybe more sexually and psychologically rigid, more so than she is. So I think that it would have been a more interesting arc for her character, but no, we're stuck with Tom on this journey, and I don't think it's all his fault either. I think a lot of it is the writing, and Kubrick has done this before, where he took an actor like, for instance, Barry Lyndon, one of my all-time favorite movies, definitely one of my favorite Kubrick films. He cast Ryan O'Neal in that film, and before I had seen the film, I thought, okay, that's a really weird choice, because I always thought Ryan O'Neal had this sort of blankness, but in the film we discover so much more. There's something within that blankness where we start to see the humanity and the emotion peering through little by little as his arc becomes more well-defined. And plus in that film, there's far more at stake. His character has a full arc where his decisions are mirrored in the second half, and it allows us to see how he sort of spirals and then learns from those past decisions. But in Eyes Wide Shut, the Tom Cruise character doesn't really have much to go by as far as stakes are concerned. He's very voyeuristic in this dream sequence, or whatever you want to call it. At the beginning of it, a woman confesses her love to him, and he's not sure what to think, so we don't really get to see his reaction there. He is lured into an apartment by a prostitute, but nothing really happens there because he feels guilty. And then he wanders into this very opulent orgy at this mansion that is, of course, a very famous scene, and all he does is really just observe this very, I guess you could call it, like, very real. It feels ritualistic. It's a very kind of almost religious ceremony with all these kind of salacious acts going on. And the direction, of course, really lures you into these experiences. Don't get me wrong. But again, I have to ask, what is really at stake here? What are we learning about this character? What is he gaining from any of this, other than that he's just a bystander in his own dream because of guilt or whatever, and temptation? But these are all very basic ideas. It's this idea of wanting to have that detached sexual desire devoid of connection or love, and maybe including a sort of a sense of cruelty in there. But he has all this shame, worrying that he's going to be caught. And it makes sense in the sense that he is a person he's been married a long time and he has a daughter. So maybe he isn't as sexually adventurous, but he certainly has the thoughts and the desires to go there. It's very clear. And I wish the film pushed further in terms of that sexuality. I really wanted this film to get more racy, actually. I wanted it to be more raw, so we can sense that kind of seething brutality that's within him, the primality. But as it stands, it feels very deliberate and very choreographed. When he has these little scenes throughout with just random people that enter the film, they touch on interesting ideas, and I like the scenes as they stand on their own. They're all really interesting, but I wish that they could have played with more there. There is a moment, I will say, later on in the film. I mentioned earlier that at the beginning of his little journey through the night, there's the woman who confesses her love to him, and he doesn't really have a response. And later on in the film, he calls her, but her fiance picks up, and he's quiet and he hangs up. And I was like, oh, okay, now there you go. He's making a conscious decision to do something. We're seeing something about him being revealed, whether it's feelings or lack thereof, or how it relates to his own marriage, but they kind of just left it there. He's constantly tempted but pulls back, tempted and pulls back. And for a film that is trying to explore sexuality, it didn't push far enough for me. And a lot of the scenes that I mentioned, while they're interesting, they just don't say much about humanity or sexuality. They feel very expected. I feel like the movie wants to be satirical at times, and I think you really see that, especially in the scene where he's buying the costume at the costume shop. And I think it's trying to have drama and have sort of an artistic, erotic feel to it. But I don't think any of that is well-rounded. I would say that if you want to watch a movie that really handles sexuality well, that Kubrick has done in the past, that is also kind of contrasted with a kind of prudish social setting, watch Lolita. That film, it's an early film of Kubrick's. It came out in 1962, I believe. And that film just achieves excellence everywhere that this film didn't for me. Everything about it works for me. It's funny. It's really satirical. It's bizarre. The characters are all so interesting. They're so layered in terms of their motivations. It's a fascinating film to watch. I adore it. And there he fully realized his ideas psychologically. But here, and I think this happens a lot actually with directors who achieve a sort of legendary status at a certain point, they become a victim to their own style. So even with somebody like Kubrick, who is known for being very controversial, in a way, ironically, that becomes part of his comfort zone. And I know that sounds really weird to say, but it is. He becomes kind of self-indulgent, afraid to kind of push for more. And I feel like this film is maybe the perfect example of that. But I have to say, I mean, Kubrick is such a complex man and a complex artist, and one where each time you see his films, you feel differently. As I said at the beginning, I've seen this film many times and I've always really loved it. And this was the first time where I didn't. So maybe I could come back to it in a year or two and have a different reaction. That's completely possible. And I also understand that this is a film very much open to interpretation because it is very ambiguous. And I understand that my interpretation is merely my own interpretation, and that many people, you probably all think I'm crazy right now. And you can probably try to talk me out of what I'm feeling. And I'm totally willing to listen to you, hear you out, and all of that. So yeah, I'm torn here. There are parts of this film that I do admire, but I also think that there's a lot left to be desired as well. But, you know, he's still one of my favorites. I just think there are better films that he has made. And that's also why I tend to be a little bit tougher, because I know what he's capable of, and he just didn't do it for his last film. But that is my review. Thank you all for listening. If you would like to check out any of my social media information, it's below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.